The small town of Oakdale, nestled in the heart of the countryside, was a place where everyone knew each other's names, and the local diner served as the town's gathering spot. It was a tight-knit community where tradition and family values were deeply ingrained. However, beneath the town's idyllic facade, a long-standing family feud had been simmering, waiting to erupt into a tragic confrontation. At the center of this family drama were two male cousins, Jack and Alex. They were the grandsons of Henry and Margaret, the patriarch and matriarch of the family. The roots of their animosity lay in the complicated history of their family. Henry and Margaret had built their fortune through hard work and shrewd business deals. They had two sons, John and Michael, who were Jack and Alex's fathers. However, the brothers had never gotten along, and their rivalry had created a rift in the family. As the years passed, the tension between John and Michael only intensified. They had fundamentally different personalities and values, and their disagreements often turned into heated arguments. Their wives, Jack's mother, Emily, and Alex's mother, Sarah, tried to mediate their husbands' disputes, but their efforts were often in vain. The animosity between John and Michael was palpable, and it soon spread to their children. Jack and Alex grew up hearing their father's bitter arguments and witnessing the tension between them. As a result, they developed a strong dislike for each other, which only deepened as they grew older. Despite their grandparents' efforts to bring the family together, the rift between Jack and Alex continued to widen. Henry and Margaret had always hoped that their grandsons would put aside their differences and become close, but it seemed that their hatred for each other was too deeply ingrained. As the years went by, the tension between Jack and Alex only intensified. They would often clash at family gatherings, their arguments escalating into heated shouting matches. Their grandparents, who had always been the glue that held the family together, were at a loss for how to bring their grandsons back together. But beneath the surface of their animosity, a more sinister motive was driving Jack and Alex's behavior. Their grandparents' wealth, which had been amassed over decades, was now up for grabs. Henry and Margaret were growing older, and it was only a matter of time before they passed away, leaving their vast fortune to their grandsons. The prospect of inheriting their grandparents' wealth had become an all-consuming obsession for Jack and Alex. They were both determined to get their hands on the inheritance, no matter the cost. And as they waited for their grandparents to pass away, the tension between them continued to build, setting the stage for a tragic confrontation that would change their lives forever. The origins of the family feud dated back to the brothers' childhood. They had grown up in a competitive household where their parents had always encouraged them to strive for excellence. However, as they grew older, their competitive nature turned into a bitter rivalry. The feud began when their parents decided to divide their business empire between the two brothers. The older brother felt that he deserved a larger share of the business, while the younger brother felt that he had been unfairly overlooked. The disagreement escalated into a heated argument, and the brothers stopped speaking to each other. The grandparents were caught in the middle of the feud. They had always tried to remain neutral, but it was difficult to do so when their sons and grandsons were at odds with each other. Despite their best efforts, the feud continued to simmer, waiting to erupt into a tragic confrontation. The grandparents' wealth was a topic of much discussion and speculation within the family. Their business empire, built over decades, had generated a vast fortune that would be the envy of many. The grandparents' estate, a grand mansion with sprawling gardens and a private lake, was a testament to their wealth and success. As the grandparents grew older, the cousins' desire to inherit their wealth became increasingly intense. Jack and Alex had always been aware of the wealth that would one day be theirs, and they had grown accustomed to the luxurious lifestyle that it provided. The terms of the will were clear. The grandparents' estate would be divided equally between their two sons, with a smaller portion set aside for their grandchildren. However, the cousins were not satisfied with this arrangement. They each wanted the entire inheritance for themselves, and they were willing to do whatever it took to get it. As the cousins' desire for the inheritance grew, so did the tension between them. They began to argue more frequently, and their disagreements became more heated. The atmosphere in the family became increasingly toxic, with everyone walking on eggshells around the cousins. Other family members, such as the cousins' parents and younger siblings, were also affected by the inheritance. They too had a stake in the grandparents' wealth, and they were anxious to see how it would be divided. The family's employees, who had been loyal to the grandparents for many years, were also concerned about their future. They had heard rumors that the cousins planned to sell the estate and divide the proceeds, which would leave them without jobs. As the grandparents' health began to decline, the cousins' desire for the inheritance became even more intense. They began to visit their grandparents more frequently, trying to curry favor and gain an advantage over each other. The atmosphere in the family became increasingly tense, with everyone waiting with bated breath to see what would happen next. The grandparents, sensing the tension in the family, tried to reassure everyone that they would be taken care of. However, their words of comfort did little to ease the cousins' anxiety. They were convinced that the inheritance was theirs for the taking, and they were willing to do whatever it took to get it. The final confrontation between Jack and Alex took place on a stormy night, in the grand mansion that had been the site of so many family gatherings. The tension between the cousins had been building for months, and it seemed inevitable that it would eventually boil over into violence. The argument started in the study, where Jack and Alex had agreed to meet to discuss the future of the family business. But as soon as they sat down, it became clear that they were not going to be able to agree. Jack was determined to take control of the business, while Alex was equally determined to stop him. The argument quickly escalated, with both cousins shouting and screaming at each other. They stood up, their faces red with rage, and began to circle each other. The air was thick with tension, and it seemed as though anything could happen. And then, in an instant, everything changed. Jack lunged at Alex, his fists flying, and Alex responded in kind. The two cousins crashed to the floor, punching and kicking each other with all their might. The fight was intense and brutal, with both cousins giving it their all. They rolled around the room, knocking over chairs and tables, and sending books and papers flying. It was a chaotic and terrifying scene, and it seemed as though it would never end. But eventually, it did. The fight finally subsided, and the two cousins lay on the floor, exhausted and battered. They looked up at each other, their eyes filled with hatred and anger, and for a moment, it seemed as though they might start fighting again. But then, something unexpected happened. Jack, who had been lying on the floor, suddenly sat up and reached into his pocket. He pulled out a gun, and before Alex could react, he had fired it. The sound of the gunshot was deafening, and it seemed to echo through the room forever. Alex's eyes widened in shock, and he looked down to see that he had been shot. He tried to speak, but no words would come. And then, in a shocking twist, Jack turned the gun on himself. He pulled the trigger, and the sound of the second gunshot was just as deafening as the first. The room was silent now, except for the sound of the storm raging outside. The two cousins lay on the floor, their bodies still and lifeless. It was a tragic and senseless end to a feud that had been building for years. As the news of the tragedy spread, the family was left to pick up the pieces. They were shocked and devastated by the loss of their loved ones, and they struggled to come to terms with what had happened. The mansion, which had once been a symbol of the family's wealth and prosperity, was now a reminder of their tragedy. It stood empty and silent, a testament to the devastating consequences of the cousins' hatred for each other. The news of the tragic event spread like wildfire through the community, leaving everyone in shock and disbelief. The family was devastated, and the relationships between the remaining family members were forever changed. Jack's parents were consumed by grief and guilt, wondering if they could have done something to prevent the tragedy. They were also angry, feeling that Alex had been the aggressor and that Jack had been driven to defend himself. They became withdrawn and isolated, unable to face the reality of what had happened. Alex's parents, on the other hand, were filled with anger and resentment. They blamed Jack's parents for not doing enough to prevent the tragedy, and they felt that the justice system had failed them. The younger siblings were also deeply affected by the tragedy. They had lost to people they loved, and they were struggling to come to terms with what had happened. The community was also shocked and saddened by the tragedy. They had known the family for years, and they couldn't believe that something like this could happen. They came together to support the family, offering condolences and assistance in any way they could. As the investigation into the tragedy began, it became clear that there were many questions that needed to be answered. The police were called to the scene, and they began to gather evidence and interview witnesses. The investigation revealed that the tragedy had been the result of a long-standing feud between the two cousins. It also revealed that Jack had been struggling with mental health issues, and that he had been taking medication to manage his symptoms. As the investigation continued, it was realized that the tragedy had been preventable. The family had known about the feud between the two cousins, and they had done nothing to stop it. They had also ignored Jack's mental health issues, and they had not provided him with the support and resources he needed. The investigation led to a number of charges being laid against the family members. Jack's parents were charged with negligence, and Alex's parents were charged with harassment. The younger siblings were also charged with obstruction of justice for their role in covering up the tragedy. The trial was a dramatic and emotional affair, with both sides presenting their case to the court. The prosecution argued that the family had been negligent and reckless, and that they had contributed to the tragedy. The defense argued that the tragedy had been an accident, and that the family had done nothing wrong. In the end, the court found the family members guilty of the charges laid against them. However, taking into account the devastating loss they had already suffered, the court decided to impose a more lenient sentence. The family members were fined a significant amount and ordered to perform community service. They were also required to attend counseling sessions to deal with their grief and guilt. The sentence was seen as a way to hold the family members accountable for their actions, while also acknowledging the immense pain and suffering they had already endured. The community was divided in their opinion on the sentence, with some feeling that it was too lenient, while others believed that it was fair and just. The family members, meanwhile, were left to pick up the pieces and try to rebuild their lives. They struggled to come to terms with what had happened and to find a way to heal and move forward. The tragedy left a deep scar on the family, and it would take time, effort, and support for them to recover. The tragic events that unfolded in the small town of Oakdale serve as a stark reminder of the devastating consequences of unchecked hatred and greed. The senseless loss of life, the destruction of a family, and the irreparable damage to the community are all a testament to the destructive power of these twin evils. As we reflect on the events that led to the tragic confrontation between Jack and Alex, it is clear that their hatred for each other was fueled by a desire for wealth and power. Their greed and ambition consumed them, leading them down a path of destruction and chaos. The consequences of their actions are a stark reminder of the importance of forgiveness, understanding, and compassion. If only Jack and Alex had been able to put aside their differences and work towards a common goal, the tragedy that unfolded might have been avoided, but it was not to be. The hatred and greed that consumed Jack and Alex ultimately led to their downfall, and the devastating consequences of their actions will be felt for generations to come. As we bring this story to a close, we are reminded that the choices we make have consequences, and that the destructive power of hatred and greed can have far-reaching and devastating effects. But even amid tragedy, there is hope. The story of Jack and Alex serves as a cautionary tale, reminding us of the importance of forgiveness, understanding, and compassion. As we bring this story to a close, we are reminded that the choices we make have consequences, and that the destructive power of hatred and greed can have far-reaching and devastating effects. But even amid tragedy, there is hope. The story of Jack and Alex serves as a cautionary tale, reminding us of the importance of forgiveness, understanding, and compassion. What lessons do you think society can learn from this case? Share your thoughts below. If you found this story compelling, please consider sharing it to spread awareness. Like this video, subscribe to uncover more true crime stories where deception and truth collide. Click here to watch another chilling case in our series.